Welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our business line leader here at Intertek. And today I'm joined by Chris Wyman, who's our industry leader in the US for medical. Welcome to our conversation, Chris. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yes, very excited to chat all things medical and what the state is currently with medical devices here in the US specifically, but also looking more at some other geographies as well. So Chris, you've been in the industry a long time, right? How many years now?
Going on 19.
19 years, right? Working with medical device manufacturers. So you've seen everything from the early days of, early 60601 through to 60601 risk-based approach, third edition, all the amendments. So what are you seeing now currently with medical device manufacturers in 2022?
So I think we're starting to see, supply chains recovering, R&D cycles unfreezing, clients coming back into the laboratory. I think, pre-pandemic, we were seeing a lot in digital home healthcare. Mm-hmm. You're kind of that confluence of ICT and radio modules in med devices. Obviously an uptick in respiratory, uptick in medical robotics, as well as medical lasers. So all in all, I think the industry as a whole, it's really, everyone's back to work as usual, and just prepping, their files and getting devices back into the chambers and into bench.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting when you mention like pre-pandemic, what we were seeing with medical devices in the industry versus now. And, it's hard to say that we're post-pandemic, but now that we're, in this kind of recovery mode and coming into a different phase of the pandemic, right? So before we were seeing pretty steady growth in the industry, but certainly medical and medical devices was no stranger to supply chain issues and all of the issues that impacted, consumers and everybody else, right, in a day-to-day sort of way. And now we're seeing, I think to your point, right, a lot of people are starting to come back and put together those regulatory plans and pathways and, think about how they're going to be able to move forward in this kind of next phase where we are dealing with, everything that we are externally with the pandemic, but moving into a new phase with their devices.
Yeah, of course. I mean, really what we're starting to see is, even before the pandemic, with some of the new amendments and guidance out there, the market was already shifting away from, you take a market like Europe that manufacturers are trying to get in under the medical device directive, which is now the medical device regulation.
Mm-hmm. Recently, right? Yeah, really recently.
Yeah, very recently. Yeah. And all the preparation that would have to go into that for a company, for regulatory affairs, for quality to kind of change those internal systems. And obviously the education, right? The education comes from your partner who is the laboratory or could be your notified body. So there's just a lot of tribal language that has to be right and paths that need to be followed. But as you start seeing these, I don't want to call them complex medical devices, but medical devices that have multiple functions, right? They have, particular standards. Some of them have 4 Part 2s, and there's new devices going into the home that have temperature, pulse ox, everything attached to your
yeah.
When you start looking at these devices, the preparation for each market, it kind of, we can put together a project that has all, global compliance factored into it, but it's misaligned and there is alignment in the market. It's definitely causing confusion with our customers, but that's why we have a job, right? On that, that pathway.
Well, and I think another interesting thing that we saw too with the pandemic, right? Our industry is, no different than any other, right? With the attrition rates and people leaving their jobs or moving jobs. So now you also have a lot of people who are maybe new to the medical devices space or new to the regulatory space for medical devices, or maybe teams are, half the size. So there's a lot more support that they might need in terms of preparation and getting ready, because not only are we dealing with new versions of standards, right, for both safety and EMC, as well as new regulations with the MDR, things that we're seeing from the FDA. So, starting kind of at that, getting ready for the lab space, right? What can we do as a third party, as someone, that a manufacturer would be coming to for testing? What can we do to help prepare people for this journey?
Well, when you start with any project, especially in medical, I remind the reps in our team that there is that conversation, which is discovery. And it's not just an RFQ, right? You need to figure out what that customer or manufacturer's objective is, what that first step is. That first step could be, an FDA 510K submission. It could be an MDR regulatory submission, preparing a tech file, or it could be right out of the gates, I want full certification, I want global compliance. But I think it has to start, it's really two-pronged. It has to start with documentation, reviewing that documentation, the checklist, like essential performance, accompanying docs, prepping them for what could be a very cumbersome task, through a 2-3 month process. But most of the manufacturers, when, early on in the podcast, we were discussing, what does it look like? And those unfreezing of the budgets and the supply chain, you're starting to see more manufacturers run EMC pre-scans. They're trying to pass, Table 11, new editions of 4th edition EMC Amendment 1. They're coming in, they want to cycle through that, humidity chamber and run post-temp leakage. Their concerns are on how robust is their design for home healthcare? How am I going to pass ingress protection testing? So they're almost planning and trying to mitigate any failures that could delay them even further trying to get to market.
Right. So as a manufacturer, right, I'm looking at, okay, how can I prepare myself, right, align myself from a documentation standpoint, from a pre-compliance testing standpoint, to be ready for when I enter the lab. I think, it is interesting when we look at the market itself, right? We want to make sure that, we're getting products to market a lot faster, right? Because we've had this delay with the pandemic. We've seen, the stopping of elective surgeries and procedures. We've seen, delays and declines throughout the industry. And so now as we're trying to ramp back up and get back, get our products back out to the market, it is that idea of, okay, what can I do to condense my timeline, get ready to go, be ready for when I enter the laboratory by doing, pre-scans, preliminary documentation kind of reviews and work. So that way, when I actually get to the process of going through, maybe I save some time on the back end. Maybe I, save some time to when I'm putting my submission in towards the FDA, right? So I think, getting to that point is where, there's things that, we can do as a test lab and a third party. And there's other ways that a manufacturer can get themselves prepared early on. So then, you go through that process, you do your testing process. Of course, we're dealing with these new versions of the standard, new requirements for testing. And then I think one of the biggest topics and one of the things that we see a lot of people asking questions about or wondering about is, this idea of the FDA and 510Ks or different types of submission. We saw a lot of EUAs, right? Emergency use authorizations throughout the pandemic. And now we see some of those people coming back because they want to go for a full submission, full 510K. So obviously there's a lot of different pathways and options and things that you can do. So are there ways that, people like us as a third party can provide support for a 510K FDA submission? What are we seeing from the FDA? Like, in your day-to-day, what are you seeing specifically with the FDA?
So, there's a couple of different things. You have Intertek participating in the ASCA program. So all of our medical laboratories in the US, I want to say that I think that Intertek has the most laboratories.
We do. Yes, we do. Yeah, we have the most in the program.
That just assures clients confidence that when they approach the FDA with their submission, that they're going to get, a first time pass through with that confidence that everything in that test report, is approved by an accredited lab, right? So that's the first step. But really, when you're speaking to a manufacturer and their first step is a 510K submission, there's a lot of requirements and steps in the process to be certified. And I think it's important to have that conversation with a manufacturer, small or large, that there is such thing as clearance when you clear market, and that when you're certified to market. Mm-hmm. Not every manufacturer coming into the lab can achieve both within that allotted time frame. I call it the paramedic customer that wants to come into the laboratory and gives you essentially a 45-day clock to when they need to submit, right? Typically, that's not enough time to get through all the certification requirements. So we've created, Type IC informative reports, non-ASCA. I have to, preface that, that they can go ahead and cycle through all the testing, get the test reports, get the informative Type IC reports that would suffice a submission. That would be on your base standard. It would be on your EMC collateral. And then if and when home healthcare collateral would apply, or if there was a very specific particular standard that would apply, right? And so, as you know, when the customer has those reports, they can then go package it in a 510K. But what that achieves is that's that speed to market to get the bare bones for your 510K submission, while you're also working towards certifying. Because manufacturers, when they clear, they automatically want to sell in the market. So, it's just keeping in mind that there's different ways and different strategies out there to help manufacturers get to market. Most of the manufacturers that come in, they want everything, and they kind of want it neat and fit in a box with a timeline, but you don't always plan for non-conformances or non-conformances. Mm-hmm. So again, going back to pre-compliance, that's why it's extremely important in, really tackling the cumbersome documentation early on in the process.
Yeah. And I think, we have to give the FDA a lot of credit, right, for the strides that they've made and the things that they're doing differently, right? We see this introduction of the Ask a Pilot program, right, really as a way to work with manufacturers and make the process easier and faster going through the FDA approval process. But I think we also see, a large level of collaboration from the FDA with manufacturers, right? Not just with us as a test lab and a third party, but also, we see them working with manufacturers in a very specific way, providing all of these different sorts of guidance documents that we're seeing coming out, really trying to keep up with technologies and changes and things that are going on. So are there things like that you've been seeing from the FDA specifically in terms of, support, or even anecdotally things that we're hearing back that the FDA is maybe putting bigger focus on, or asking more about, or pushing to, see more data or more objective evidence? Are there things kind of in that space that you've seen from working with our manufacturers?
Yeah. So, so far in this podcast, we talked a lot about safety and EMC, but there are guidances for coexistence, right? Which is C63.27, or you have, the AIM RFID standard, which is 7351731. Also cyber, right? Cyber plays a role in having assessments, a plan, in your package. And what we're starting to see is deficiency letters, or maybe not first-time clearances. And the FDA will give you a lot of time to go back and find
Mm-hmm.
partner. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle, Clarissa, right? Because manufacturers are coming in, they're planning for the medical standard, right? They're very focused on that, very focused on clinicals and the efficacy built into their 510K. Usability software plays a role. But no one's talking about, well, what if you have a radio module in your device? What if a patient can take that through metal detectors, in an airplane, right? Mm-hmm. So one's having those conversations, and I don't think manufacturers like dealing with hypothetical scenarios, especially coming from the lab, which could be a question mark. What I can tell you is when the FDA will issue that letter, did you think about this? Did you think about that, how it coexists? Yeah. Those conversations are much quicker. And again, another paramedic, we need to get you back on schedule with our SMEs, our experts, which we have, right? And just really, truly partner. But in a way, it's a good reminder that when you're looking at those RFQs, when you're looking at the device as a whole, we're not just looking at this as a medical device. You're looking at the radio module. What fields could this be present in? Recently been hit with DO 160G, right? Which is really a military standard, but how is this used, in an aircraft or a fixed wing aircraft? So there's all these different scenarios.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting too, right? Because we've seen technology advance pretty rapidly, right? And I think, you see the FDA is just being inundated with different types of products and different types of technology. So there is certainly a benefit to coming and, working with someone like us on the front end to prepare that documentation, get you ready to make your FDA submittal, right? Or even, helping in those kind of deficiencies or areas where there might be additional testing needed or additional reporting that's needed. Because I think another thing, right, we have to expect this as technology advances and as things are, different, that maybe there's things that are non-standardized that they might want to see, right? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about putting products on the market for mass use, right? So maybe there's, non-standardized different types of testing or different data points that they may still ask to see just because it's newer technology or something that hasn't been out and been used in the world as, as much as other types of technologies.
Well, and we're seeing those products now. We're on a handful of EFSs, right? Early feasibility studies that new innovation has not been seen before. Some of it's implantable, right? So just the risk goes up on those types of devices, and all of these questions are arising. So those conversations on new innovation, they're happening every day here.
Right. And I think similar to the way that the standard views products and risk, right? The FDA looks at it very much in the same way, right? It's all on this kind of risk scale, risk tolerance, what are the highest risk devices? And especially as we're seeing, so many advances in these types of implantables and robotics and things that have autonomous, fully autonomous, semi-autonomous, right? There's so many things that we're seeing more of in the medical device space. And I think there was a lot, of these manufacturers that we see that, perhaps were in the technology space before, IT space before, now coming in and bringing their types of technology into the medical space or for use in a medical application. And so that presents unique challenges as well. If you're not designing with medical compliance in mind, with, risk management in mind, to then move that product into a space of, okay, now we're going to be using this as a medical application.
Yeah. You mentioned something earlier. You mentioned EUAs. So, we were on the forefront of those EUAs. We write some of those checklists. When you're talking about partnerships into the FDA, right, we have those phone calls. And really, the hope is that when you launch an EUA in the market, that you're going to see a 510K that follows, right? What we saw during the pandemic was we saw automotive companies. We saw big IT tech companies, Bay Area tech companies, EDUs, Ivy League colleges, right? Trying to work on ambu bags and ventilators and get them, and for all the right reasons. But I think we know that when you're talking about something as critical as a ventilator, and you start factoring in biocompatibility, breathing circuits, a breathing computer, sterilization, you start factoring all that in. Not all of that can be covered in an EUA. So to bring something like that to market, it requires a lot of medical knowledge, experience, capital, right? Yeah. So, it's difficult. So I think when we start seeing these other innovations, it's the same thing, right? You need to plan at the very beginning. There needs to be a timeline allotted, and you need to plan for scenarios that aren't just in a medical setting, right? They're actually in the home with consumers.
Yeah, home use, ambulatory, right? We're seeing all of these different areas that are kind of emerging that are outside of a traditional controlled patient environment, right? We're seeing devices move into all these different types of elements, right? And of course, we talk a lot about this too, right? That, with the pandemic came now everyone wanting to have healthcare at their fingertips, right? Or wanting to be able to take more control of their own healthcare, maybe not wanting to go to a hospital and having a device that they use in their bedroom or is administered by a nurse in their own home or something like that. That's different than what we saw 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Now we're just moving totally towards the other direction for convenience, for technology, for a lot of reasons.
Yep. I mean, we both do it. We both have iWatches.
Yeah.
You go to the gym and you're looking at your heart rate, right? And it's fun in a way. And I think that's why the future is really bright in med device, right? Because we're going to start seeing different shifts. And we're even seeing shifts in the OR with some of these devices, whether it's surgical robotics or, medical lasers. Again, hitting back on respiratory, right? We're starting to see new generations of these products and devices, coming out. So
yeah, and I think we see now too, right? The regulatory goals, right, and where we're trying to go with products, right? So you're coming to the FDA, you want to get onto the U.S. market, wonderful, and then also looking at Europe with the MDR, as we talked about at the beginning, right? Dates that were just recently passed by, right? MDR is in effect, it's out there. People are, moving forward with it. So when you see manufacturers who are looking to go to Europe specifically, right, and looking at the MDR, what have you been hearing from the market? What are you seeing from manufacturers who are looking at in the MDR space?
Well, first, we knew about MDR,
a long time.
And I think there is a phrase that needs to be highlighted. It's called state of the art. Mm-hmm. And I think we all need to remember that in regulatory. And I'm not just talking about Intertek or ATIC labs. I'm talking about manufacturers. I'm talking about the whole community, right? And we heard about this word, and then we had EUAs, and then we had the pandemic. And now we have manufacturers cycling back into the lab. And some of them, well, during the pandemic, were generating these medical devices against third edition amendment 1, right, which is the standard, right? Not every market, but most global markets. And there was harmonization. But the word state of the art is that, as a medical manufacturer, when you go to Europe and you submit a tech file, you're choosing a notified body. That notified body can dictate what that state of the art is. And then you also have regulatory affairs department with our customers, and they see these standards published on Google search engines, which are our friends, right? Because they're fact finding, right? It's a fact, it's published. But the issue is, coming back to the laboratory, manufacturers don't always understand that there's that thing called certification, which could be CB scheme or the certification with the NCB, or it could be part of OSHA's NRTL program, for a mark. And these certification schemes recognize and have an effective date for third edition amendment 1, but not third edition amendment 2, right? It takes time for standards to be adopted. And once they're adopted, there's typically a 3 to 4 year transition date from when they're adopted to when they're effective, right? And then we notify our customers for standard updates, right? That's the process. Mm-hmm. But the notified bodies are actually looking for state of the art. So in a way, it's forcing the market's hand to produce those Amendment 2 reports now, while you're also in parallel certifying against third edition Amendment 1. So I call it a very unique gray area or period. This period could last a year, it could last 2 years. But I think it's our job to, obviously, as the leader, right, as the leading mark in medical, in ORs, it's important for us to get it right. Right. And getting it right is partnering with our clients, educating them on the market misalignment, and ensuring that they're prepped for a technical file submission with whichever notified body they choose, but also ensuring that they're going to get global certification under 3.1 via CB scheme. Right. So it's just really important to have those conversations. Those conversations started to heat up at the beginning of the fall in 2021. And now it seems like every device that, or every manufacturer that I'm partnering with, I'm having these conversations, and it's just that automatic no-brainer that, we want to Europe, we want to go global with this. Chris, please work with the laboratories and ensure that we're set up for success.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting to see this kind of parallel path, or, the dual approach, right? Because you're moving forward with your certification with the published third edition Amendment 1, harmonized standards to that version, right, with the particulars. But then when we hear this state of the art, right, okay, then we need to go to the Amendment 2, or maybe a hybrid of the two with a particular from an older version and the base standard from the new version. So I think there's a lot of space for kind of ambiguity in there, right? To understand, okay, what exactly do I need to be doing for where I want to be going? And, this idea of notified bodies looking at state of the art all comes down to the same thing that we talked about with the FDA, right? The risk of products, wanting products to be as safe and effective as possible, right? So we're looking at, okay, what is state of the art? What does state of the art mean? And that's what we're hearing back from manufacturers who have already started going through the process with the MDR, right? Because some people have already looked to move towards that. So we, are getting some of this kind of feedback, anecdotal feedback from customers saying, okay, I'm being asked to go to this state of the art version. I think it's also interesting too, when you mention the other kind of driver for that we sometimes see as well is the manufacturers themselves, right? I mean, as a manufacturer, you want to make sure that you're testing to the latest and greatest version of either the base standard, or if you have a part 2 standard that's published that is to a newer version, because you are doing your absolute due diligence. You want to make sure that your risk profile is low and that you're mitigating risk. And so you move towards this, okay, here's the state of the art version of the base standard or of the part 2 standard. And I want to make sure as a manufacturer that I've achieved that by going that extra mile and maybe having certification to one version, but also having supporting reports to newer versions to show that you've taken all of that into consideration.
You bring up a great point. So you're talking about part 2. So even within the misalignment, there's even more granularity that I'm finding. So when you certify a product against CB scheme, the customer, the manufacturer owns that certificate. There's no recourse for Intertek or somebody to take that certificate away. So in essence, it's up to them to maintain that technical file with their notified body. If their notified body doesn't hit them with a kappa on maybe an older version of a particular standard, and they choose not to upgrade that in any given time with Intertek, now they're coming and wanting amendment to 2020 gap. An old version of the standard, which could have been revised maybe once or twice. So now they're having to upgrade against Amendment 1 just to get a gap report for Amendment 2. So we're starting to see even more granularity, and I think there's going to be more. This is definitely a moving target. It's a fluid situation. Obviously, we're doing our best to educate our staff, our engineers, prep for this, work on checklists, but you have to think there's 90 plus particular standards out there. There's a lot of tests, a lot of TRFs. We have new Part 2s coming online for even respiratory. So it's a great opportunity to, start partnering with market and start just preparing, the clients for success.
Yeah. And I think too, one of the things you kind of touched on and from the perspective of manufacturer, right, you can partner early with the test lab, but I also think we've seen such great things out of the notified bodies and out of the FDA as well, that, if you have questions about, okay, what standards should we be going to? What are you going to be looking at? Questions about what state of the art means. We see a lot of really positive success stories with manufacturers working with their notified body or working with the FDA to kind of determine what might exactly be needed and then coming back to us, because it is, as you say, right, a very interesting time in the market. It's a learning time for everybody because we have these different versions and standards. We have technology moving at this very, very rapid pace, and everyone's trying to kind of work together and keep up and keep in alignment. So that way we're all, achieving the same goal of getting medical devices and medical technology to market in a quick, safe, efficient, effective way. Right. And so there's a lot of opportunity there, I think, as well, for a manufacturer to reach out to the FDA and have a pre-submission meeting or a discussion or work with their notified body early on to say, hey, this is our plan, or this is what we're thinking about testing to. And then they'll have that idea of, okay, well, maybe you should also have reports to the amendment to support this idea of state of the art.
You're bringing up a great point, and you've highlighted this twice really with the FDA. And my experience with the FDA, at least what I heard from clients early in my career, is they were difficult to deal with, and it was the agency, right? And as you and I started maybe attending AdvaMed and MedTech and really sitting in on some of the FDA, forums and meetings, they're people just like us, and they actually want to make their organization much better. They want to cleaner, quicker. You and I both know the director of CDRH, and they've really outlined a map on how to get submissions through quicker and how to improve the process and get more collaborators and experts on the standards. We have dozens of SMEs that sit on committees, right? And those committees could be FDA, or they could be, a standard writing body, right? So, it's really it's more collaboration than I've seen in my career, really within the last 4 years. And the FDA has been very, very open about, listen, 5 years ago, it took us a year to clear a 510K. Now we can do it, within a month and a half, within 2 months. And I think what you're starting to see is the markets are a little inverted, right? Because, when we first started working in med device, it was kind of easy to get into Europe, right? I mean, clients wanted CE marking, which was new back in the early 2000s. And it's strange. It's odd in a way how times have changed. Now it's a little bit more difficult to get into Europe, a little bit longer, and it's a little bit quicker to get through the FDA. So, I think you start seeing some processes, and you and I have heard the real world evidence. And I think, you're starting to see, the FDA, you're starting to see, regulators in Europe, they're starting to kind of adopt some of these principles.
Well, Chris, this was such a great conversation. I love talking about medical compliance with you. We'll leave it there for today. Really appreciate your time. If anyone has questions, of course, they can email them in to me, and Chris will be happy to have you back on Medical Compliance with Clarissa to talk more about all things medical compliance in the future. So thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Definitely want to do this again. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.